G'day, I'm Warwick Schiller and welcome back to the Principles of Training. Today we're going to talk about the principle that's pretty universal, and that's the application of your aids. So the principle governing the application of your aids is one that I see that all around the world. I get to have dressage riders and eventers and show jumpers and stuff, people from the English disciplines at my clinics, and they are all very, very, very good at the application of your go forward aids. It's basically a standard thing worldwide. I've talked to dressage people from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, all over the UK, Germany, Holland, Belgium, Spain. I think that's it. And everybody has the same, everybody's taught the same thing. Your application of your going forward aids, you start out with a subtle aid, and it's probably, if you want to be really subtle, start out with a subtle seat aid, followed by a subtle leg aid, which if you're riding with a dressage whip, could be followed by your dressage whip, and when you get what you want, you're going to release all of those aids. Okay, you're not going to keep kicking, you're not going to keep tapping with your whip, you're going to release all those aids. That is not a dressage principle. That is a horse principle. That's something horses do with each other in a herd situation. If a horse asks another horse to do something, okay, they will ask with a very subtle suggestion, maybe a facial expression, okay? And if the other one doesn't recognize that, they'll go to a bigger facial expression, which will be pinning their ears. If the other horse doesn't respond to that, they'll actually physically move towards them, but they still maintain the facial expression and they still maintain pinning their ears. And they go towards them. If that doesn't work, they'll go faster towards them or get bigger, or may even have to bite and kick in extreme cases. But then once that happens and the other horse does what they want, all of those aids, so to speak, will go away. And that's the secret to the application of aids. It always starts out subtle, and if it's going to get bigger, it gets bigger incrementally till you get what you want, and they all go away. What the horse does not do, he doesn't make a face and pin his ears, and then when he moves towards the other horse, put his ears up and change his face, because him moving towards that other horse would have a completely different meaning if his ears were up and he had a pleasant expression on his face. And so the same thing with, say, let's say a leg aid followed by your whip aid. You would not ever use your whip first, leg second. You would not use your whip and your leg at the same time. You would not use your leg and then when they didn't go, release your leg and then add your whip. You would add your leg or your seat, whatever it is that comes first, you would add that subtly, and then you will back it up from there, but they all stay on until they go away. So that is that's how people apply leg aids, and I just listed some of the things that you wouldn't do. So if you're ever like in doubt about the application of aids, just think about what horses do. So we've all at some point in time had a riding lesson where the instructor said, now don't nag your horse. And what they mean is, don't say you're nagging with your leg. Nagging with your leg would mean you're either using your leg ineffectively, or your horse has done what you want and you're still using your leg for some reason. So just think about what horses do. If one horse wanted the other horse to move, it would start out subtly and increase that level of pressure. But when they get what they want, they would completely release it. It's the same thing with your leg. If you use your leg, they should respond to it. If they don't respond to it, doing the same amount of leg over and over and over is probably not going to help. It's that old saying, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting results to change. Horses know that saying. If a horse makes a face and pins his ears at another horse and it doesn't work, he doesn't go, well, maybe if I just pin my ears for another 5 minutes, he might get it. Does that make sense there? So that's why if your horse is not responding to whatever aid you're asking with, you will back it up with something else. But it's always subtle, and it'll escalate from there. Another thing that horses do with the application of aids is it tends to flow. They don't stop and start. Like a horse doesn't tell another horse to go away, no, hang on, let me wait for a while. Yeah, I want you to go away. You know, basically horses aren't really interested in asking another horse to do something unless they're really wanting that horse to do it. Horses don't cry wolf, so to speak, and so we have to make sure with our application of aids we don't cry wolf, that we don't ask for something that we don't want. We have to make sure that we only ask for what we want, and we have to make sure we get some sort of response before we let go. So something else you have to remember that's very important is the application of aids is not just your seat and your legs. Anything you want your horse to respond to, you have to be careful how you apply that aid all the time. And I do a lot of groundwork, okay? So in my groundwork, I'm using, you know, I've got a lead rope and a rope halter here, and I'll also use this flag here. But it's the same application of aids. You might notice this lead rope always has slack in it. The only time the slack is going to come out of the lead rope is when I want the horse to move his feet, okay? If you had a horse that was hard to lead, you know, when you pick up he didn't lead very well, I guarantee you there's probably some other times where you pick up, he doesn't respond to it, you're not really expecting him to respond to it, and then you let go. So you're telling that horse that the response to the pressure coming off this lead rope all the time does not mean the same thing. Sometimes it means go, sometimes it doesn't mean go. That would be like teaching your horse that sometimes I'm going to add leg, and sometimes I don't want you to do anything, but other times I add leg, I want you to do something. That'd be quite confusing to the horse. So for me, if you think about the whole leg aid, whip aid scenario as far as say dressage, there's a subtle thing at the start. And for me, the subtle thing at the start doing this groundwork and asking this horse to do something is asking them to get off the feel of this rope. So when I ask them to do something, I'm going to take the slack out of the rope. That's when I'm asking, that's my ask. And notice when he goes, I will then let that rope go. I tend to hang on to this rope here with this hand, and if I want the horse to go, I'll run my hand up that rope. But when he goes, I'm then going to put that slack back in that rope. And so it is just like your leg aid. What I don't want to do is personally, I don't want to keep my hand out there to keep him going, because if my hand stays out there all the time, how do I get him to go more? It'd be like if you had your leg on all the time. You have to use more leg to get your horse to go. You know, when he's going around here, I should be able to just take my hand and slide it down that rope if he's walking, and he should pick up an energetic trot just when I ask. It's like the accelerator in a car, or what Americans call a gas pedal. You put your foot down, every time you put your foot down it means go. It doesn't mean sometimes. So in the earlier episode that was called Don't Go to Bed Angry, I talked about managing your horse's anxiety, okay? And if your horse gets anxious, you've got to get him back down again. And you've got to recognize that they're getting anxious, and you've got to understand what causes them to be anxious. And horses can experience anxiety when they feel like they don't have control over what happens to them. And I've had a lot of horses that come in for training that were quite well trained under saddle, very responsive to all the aids under saddle, but they still were quite worried about the world in general. And I think those horses' worry stemmed from not being able to control what happens to them. Like under saddle, they know how to control the rider's leg aids. If the leg goes on and they go forward, there is no repercussion to that. But a lot of those horses that I've had that come in with anxiety problems, a lot of them were led by the chin, what I call led by the chin, which means they were held onto right here all the time. Now if I apply pressure to that lead rope and that halter, Bundy moves backwards. I don't have to pull on it, but if I go to touch that, he softens and moves backwards, because I only ever touch that when I want something to happen. And so if you were to hang on to this all the time, with no release of pressure, and then maybe your horse rears up and then you let go or something like that, you're actually teaching that horse to not respond to that, but then at times you do want him to respond to that. And I really feel a lot of anxiety comes from that. If you look at all the really good horsemen in the world that you see that have horses that are mentally stable, those horsemen always deal with the horses like this, okay? You might see people who are good with horses and have those horses do some amazing discipline type things, you know, as far as different disciplines. But if people's horses have emotional issues, usually you'll find that those people will be leading them around by the chin. So they're applying an aid that they don't want the horse to respond to. But then at times they do want to respond to it, but the rest of the time they want them to ignore it. And those horses can't control when that pressure gets put on there. And so it can, even something as simple as that, can add anxiety to your horse. A good case in point is a few years ago I had a 4-year-old warm blood mare that a dressage trainer had that she said she spooks at everything, she's worried about everything, and can you do some work with her? And I got the mare and started doing some groundwork with her, and she was worried about everything that moved on the ground. And like today, it's a little bit breezy here. I don't know if you can hear it in the microphone, but it's a little bit breezy. That mare in the wind, she was crazy, the whole bit. And she seemed really quite troubled about stuff, and especially doing things with her on the ground. And so I asked the trainer, I said, do you ever do anything with this horse on the ground, lunge her, you know, turn her loose in the round pen? And she goes, oh yeah, well, I'll exercise her in the round pen. And I said, can you show me that? And she said, sure. So she takes the horse into the round pen, and the horse, you know, let's say, you know, the horse is over there by the fence. And then when she wants the horse to go, she goes, trot. Okay, she whipped the horse on the bum and then said trot. Okay, so the application of her aids was all backwards. Now, if you listen to this whip, it sounds a bit like the wind through the trees. Now, if you think about the application of these aids, the subtle thing that came before the crack on the bum was that noise, and then the horse got cracked on the bum. There was no ask before that, it was just that noise. So consequently, I mean, that noise there made this horse go crazy, okay? Because she thought that noise meant go. And so it's just the application of the aid. She had them backwards. Instead of asking the horse to go and then following through, she put pressure on, you know, put a lot of pressure on the horse and then put a little bit of pressure. She thought she was putting a little bit of pressure, but if you think about it, the aid was that noise. That happened before the horse got cracked on the bum. So, like I said, anything remotely sounding like that made that horse go. So there are 4 quadrants to training. You've probably heard these before, but there's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. And the 2 reinforcing ones, when you reinforce something, you increase the likelihood of it happening again. When you use punishment, you are decreasing the likelihood of it happening again. You're trying to deter it. But what horses do with each other is negative reinforcement. And some people get confused about this, and they think negative reinforcement is called negative reinforcement because it's negative, because it's bad. If it's all that bad, horses wouldn't get along very well, but it's not that. Negative reinforcement is about the removal of something, okay? It's the minus sign. Positive reinforcement is about the addition of something, okay? You add something. Negative reinforcement is the removal of something, and it's removal of pressure in this case. And so, as I said before, what horses do, they start out with something subtle and get bigger and bigger and bigger till they get the change they want, and then they remove all of those pressures, and that's what marks that thing. And if you see how horses do that, they'll start out with something very small and get bigger and get bigger and bigger until they get what they want. The next time they start out with something small and they get bigger and bigger, and without getting as big as the time before, they'll get what they want. And it's how they refine it down, and eventually, you know, let's say a horse makes a face, then pins his ears, then runs at the horse with his teeth bared, and then bites it, and then kicks it till it does whatever he wants, and then he quits. And then the next time he makes a face, pins his ears, runs at the horse with his teeth bared, bites it, and it runs off. And he quits. Okay? Then the next time the same instance happens, he makes a face, pins his ears, goes towards the horse baring his teeth, and the other horse does what he wants, and he quits. And then the next time he makes a face, pins his ears, and the other horse does what he wants, and then he quits. And then eventually he can just make a face, and you've all seen this in your horses at home. One horse will just make a little subtle face and the other one will move away. And that's, horses actually train those horses to do that. They don't just move them away, they train them how to move away. They're training them how to avoid the pressure. And so there's two types of negative reinforcement. There's what they call escape and avoidance, okay? The avoidance one, think about that instance I talked about there. So the horse makes a face, pins his ears, bares his teeth, runs at the other horse. When he gets there, he turns around and kicks him. And the reason the other horse moves away is because he's escaping the kick. That horse is kicking him, and if he runs away, he can escape the kick, okay? And they'll do that as many times as they need to, but eventually they get to where he doesn't have to get to the kick anymore. So this first horse will make a face, pin his ears, go towards him, and that other horse moves away to avoid the kick. And eventually they refine it down to where just a little glance, that other horse moves away, but it's all about avoiding the kick. So escape is when you are using enough force to actually make the horse move. You know, one horse is using enough force to make the other horse move. Avoidance is when you're not using enough force to make the horse move, but if they didn't move, the thing that would make him move would come along in the end. And that's basically just your application of aids. You can't get your horse to move off a subtle seat aid. But if you use your subtle seat aid followed by a startle leg aid, and then you tap with your dressage whip till you get what you want, and you repeat that process enough times, you will eventually get to where your horse moves off your subtle seat. And so that's what we call avoidance negative reinforcement. So if you think about the application of your aids, what you're really trying to do is teach your horse to respond well to that subtle aid at the beginning. If you don't teach your horse to respond to a subtle aid, eventually you'll run out of aid. You won't be able to get your horse to do whatever you want. And a really good example happened at a clinic recently, and a guy came to the clinic and I said, "What's your biggest problem?" And he said, "Well, I have a really hard time getting my horse to canter under saddle. Like I can kind of get him to canter, but I can't really, but I got to kick a lot." And just, you know, that's where I have trouble. And if you think about back in the earlier episode of the Donkey Kong principle, and I said in the Donkey Kong principle, the early things, the little basic things are important to get really good. The big things in the end are easy. You get those little things sorted. Well, this is another example of that too. So this guy's name was John, came to a clinic, can't get the horse to canter. And I said, "How's your groundwork?" And he said, "Oh, it's pretty good." And so I said, "Well, let's just see your horse go around." And the first time he asked his horse to go, he pointed, and then he stepped towards the horse, and then he clucked and he waved his flag or whatever. But then his horse was going around, and then he asked it to go again. So then he stepped towards his horse and he waved his flag, and then he clucked and then he pointed. And then the next time he clucked, then waved the flag, then pointed, then stepped forward. And all of his application of aids, it wasn't an avoidance type situation. He wasn't teaching the horse how to avoid the flag in the end. He had to use it the whole time, and every time he used a subtle suggestion, it was a different subtle suggestion. He put them all in different orders every time. And so the first day of the clinic, that was all we did, was work on him getting his horse to where when he did his first subtle suggestion, and it doesn't matter what your suggestion is. For me, it would be just taking the slack out of the rope and pointing right there, and then the next thing would be stepping towards them, and then the next thing would be using your flag or whatever you've got. But you're only trying to use the flag to teach the horse to go. You're not trying to terrorize the horse with the flag. It's just an artificial aid. And so we did that the first day. Then the second day we came back and we started under saddle, and we broke it down into his left leg and his right leg. So if you've seen in an earlier episode where I talked about one of the first things to do under saddle is teach that horse to disengage off one leg. It's teaching the horse the response to this aid, and then teaching the horse the response to this aid. And so we went back and worked on both of those, and initially he could put his leg on and the horse would move. But if he added more leg, his horse got tight and kind of slowed down. So think about, he can put his leg on and the horse goes, but if he adds more leg, the horse gets tighter, which is going to make it impossible to canter, which means his cue doesn't work well. When he increases that pressure, his horse does not increase his output, he decreases his output. So we worked on that, getting that horse to where if he added a little more leg, he got more responsiveness at the standstill on both sides, just one leg then the other leg. Then what we started doing was getting the horse to go forward at the walk and making sure that's good. Okay, Then we worked on the trot, made sure that was good. And then when we asked him to canter, you'll see right here, this is his first ask for a canter. Okay, first time he'd asked for a canter at the clinic. And he just, as you see, the horse just canters off, and it's nice and forward, it's nice and relaxed, and it's nice and responsive. And that, you know, all these principles overlap, and that's basically the Donkey Kong principle right there, that we went back to the start and made sure all the beginning parts were really good. And the end of that was like the third level of Donkey Kong. It's quite easy to get through. So hopefully that gives you some idea about the application of aids. And just remember, when you're applying aids, you'd like to be trying to teach your horse to do something as opposed to just get them to do something. And that's something I said to John at the clinic. I said, you've been just trying to get your horse to go as opposed to teaching your horse to go. And that's what horses do with each other. They don't just get the horse to move away from their food, they teach them to get away from the food so that they can apply more and more subtle aids as they go along. So hopefully that helps you, and that's a wrap on another episode of the Principles of Training.